22 à Kigali, dans le blindé de la SNM. Avis à tous les Guinéens qui nous écoutent. Oui, à tous les Guinéens qui nous écoutent. Le Rwanda appartient à ceux qui le défendent vraiment. Et vous, les Guinéens, vous n'êtes pas des Rwandais.
inyenzi inkotanyi n'ababwiye abasirikare bacu nibo ba mbere mbabwira urubyiruko rwagutse kugira ngo bafashe abasirikare bacu mbabwira inkumi mbabwira abasore.
Welcome to the second part of our documentary on Africa's best president, Paul Kagame. If you're new to this channel, please subscribe and share our videos. Please also watch our videos on our channel, other videos. In the previous episode, we traced the journey of the Kagames from their home in Rwanda to the neighboring country of Uganda, where they started to live as refugees. The 1960s to the 1970s were meant to be Africa's independence era from the colonialists, but the excitement was short-lived. Remember, Kwame Nkrumah had just bought the idea of Pan-Africanism, and there was excitement across Africa. But the decades that followed proved anything but, as these were the years where Africa was at its most destructive, with years of civil wars, ethnic conflicts, military coup d'etats, and plunder of Africa's wealth, both by foreigners as well as Africans themselves. Rwanda and Kagames were right in the middle of this era. In this episode, we continue to follow Kagame's journey to the pinnacle of African leadership and the embodiment of Pan-Africanism. We'll look at his rise in Ugandan army and how he finally made it back to Rwanda as a military general. I know I say that there will be 2 episodes, but there will be a 3rd episode because there is just a lot to unpack. Now, after finishing his school in Uganda, Kagame made 2 visits to Rwanda in 1977 and 1978. Remember that he had moved to Uganda when he was about 4 or 5 years old. He was initially hosted by family members of his former classmates, but upon arrival in Kigali, he made contact with members of his own family. He kept a low profile on these visits, believing that his status as a well-connected Tutsi exile could lead to arrest. Remember that the Kagames were connected to the royal family that were deposed in the 1960s. On his 2nd visit, he entered the country through Zaire rather than Uganda to avoid suspicion. Kagame used his time in Rwanda to explore the country, familiarize himself with the political and social situation, and make connections that would prove useful to him in his later activities. Now let us look into his military career. In 1978, Fred Ruggiami returned to Western Uganda and reunited with Kagame. Remember, Fred Kagame was that close friend of his, a fellow Tutsi that he had made in his childhood in the camps in Uganda. During his absence, it turns out that Kagame had joined the Labour Army of Yoweri Museveni. You remember that Kagame had disappeared for a while. This army was based in Tanzania and aimed to overthrow the government of Idi Amin. Kagame then returned to Tanzania after meeting Kagame and fought in the 1979 war, in which Museveni's army, allied with the Tanzanian army and other Ugandan exiles, defeated Amini. Following Amini's defeat and inspired by Kagame, Kagame and other Rwandan refugees pledged allegiance to Museveni, who was then a cabinet member in the transition government. Kagame traveled to Tanzania, where the Tanzanian government, which sought to protect the new Ugandan regime, trained him in espionage. In late 1980, a general election was held in Uganda, which was won by former incumbent Milton Obote. But Museveni disputed the result, and he and his followers withdrew from the government in protest. In 1981, Museveni formed the Rebel National Resistance Army, NRA. Kagame and Kagame joined as founding soldiers along with 38 Ugandans. So these were actually the founding members of that army. The goal was to overthrow Obote's government in what became popularly known as the Ugandan Bush War. Kagame and Kagame joined the NRA primarily to ease conditions for Rwandan refugees persecuted by Obote. However, they also had a long-term goal of returning with other Tutsis to Rwanda. Military would their military experience would enable them to fight the Hutu-dominated Rwandan army. In the NRA, Kagame specialized in intelligence gathering, and he rose to a position close to Museveni. In 1986, the NRA captured Kampala with a force of 14,000 soldiers, including 500 Rwandans, and formed the new government. After Museveni's inauguration as president, he appointed Kagame and Kagame as senior officers in the new Ugandan army. Kagame was the head of military intelligence. As well as fulfilling their army duties, Kagame and Kagame began building a covert network of Rwandan Tutsi refugees within the army's ranks, intended as a nucleus for a putative attack on Rwanda. In 1989, Rwanda's President Habyarimana and many Ugandans in the army began to criticize Museveni over his appointment of Rwandan refugees to senior positions, which led him to demote Kagame and Kagame. So instead of standing his ground, he caved in. They remained de facto senior officers though, but the change caused them to accelerate their plans to invade Rwanda. Kagame and Kagame joined an organization called the Rwandan Patriotic Front, RPF, a refugee association which had been operating under various names since 1979. Kagame soon became the RPF leader after joining, while still working for the Ugandan army. So he and Kagame finalized their invasion plans. In October 1990, Kagame led a force of over 4,000 RPF rebels into Rwanda at the Kagitumba border post, advancing 60 kilometers south town to the town of Gabiro. Paul Kagame, remember, was not present at the initial raids as he was attending a course at the Command and General Staff College in Fort Leavenworth, United States. Kagame was killed, unfortunately, on the third day of the attack, throwing the RPF into confusion. France and Zaire then deployed forces in support of the Rwandan army, and by the end of October, the RPF had been pushed back into the far north corner of the country. Kagame returned to Africa following Kagame's death and took command of the RPF forces, which had been reduced to fewer than 2,000 troops. Kagame and his soldiers moved west through Uganda to the Virunga Mountains, a rugged high-altitude area where they were protected from attacks, and reorganized the army and carried out fundraising and recruitment from the Tutsi diaspora. Kagame restarted the war in January 1991 with a surprise attack on the northern town of Ruhengeri.
For battle. General, where does all these ammunition and weapons come from?
We buy them. We buy them from the contribution given by the Rwandese community internally here and in diaspora. There have been a very large Rwandese community outside Rwanda. We also capture a lot of equipment from the government forces.
I see a lot of South African weaponry.
Yes, you can be sure that one was captured from the Rwandese government, because they have been buying lots of arms from South Africa.
The RPF captured the town, benefiting from the element of surprise, and held it for one day before retreating back to the forests. For the next year, the RPF waged a classic hit-and-run-style guerrilla war, capturing some border areas but not making significant gains in the war against the Rwandan army. In June 1992, following the formation of a multi-party coalition government in Kigali, Kagame announced a ceasefire and began negotiations with the Rwandan government in Arusha, Tanzania. In early 1993, several extremist Hutu groups formed and began campaigns of large-scale violence against the Tutsis. Kagame responded by suspending peace talks and launching a major attack, gaining a large swath of land across the north of the country. Peace negotiations eventually resumed in Arusha, resulting in the set of agreements known as the Arusha Accords, which were signed in 1993 and gave the RPF positions in a broad-based transitional government, BBTG, and in the National Army. So this was an integration of the rebel group, the RPF, into the Rwandan government. The United Nations Assistance Mission for Rwanda, UNAMIR, a peacekeeping force, arrived in the country, and the RPF were given a base in the National Parliament building in Kigali for use during the setting up of the interim government. But note that their leader, Kagame, was not in Kigali. So shall we end it here today? There'll be a part 3, part 4, and hopefully not more than 5 parts to this series. But thank you for subscribing and thank you for watching, and I shall see you in the next couple of days. So you have a great day.